Sure. Thank you, Preeti. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me at DappCamp as one of the guest lecturers. And thanks for the introduction, Preeti. I mean, that's nothing much to be said there. So I've been doing InfoSec for a long time, mostly in the Web2 world. Discovered blockchains a while ago, jumped into Ethereum. Smart contract security made a lot of sense. So I've been, working at different with different teams on different projects, and Securium really happened or came about just over a year ago, and the bootcamp effort that is focused on smart contract security that really happened in Q4 of last year, and that's been going on since then. I'll maybe talk a bit about it at the very end if people are interested to know more about it. But yeah, I mean, this lecture is it's less of a lecture. It's more of a discussion. And what I had planned is really to share some of my perspectives on Web3 security, and these are things that you would have heard or read or maybe even worked on during DappCamp or in your current or previous jobs. But some things from a Web2 world and how those things change or amplify or are really different in some cases in the Web3 world, right? So that is really what I'm going to touch upon, and I'm going to do that at a very high level, at a 10,000, maybe even higher level. So it's not going to go into technical details of the various kinds of attacks or vulnerabilities and things like that. There is a lot of material. Rajesh was just telling me that the cohort covered some of that in the last week, and then there is a lot of material in Secureum, Open Zeppelin, Diligence, various places, right, to look at and to learn. And there's definitely no dearth of vulnerabilities and exploits in this space. So it's not hard to find that stuff. So I'll assume that, like Preeti mentioned, please feel free to stop at any point and just interject with any questions. I'm just going to keep talking, and maybe I'll pause in certain places to see if there are questions. And I'm in full screen mode, so I don't think I'll be seeing the raising of hands. So please feel free
sure.
to...
I will. Don't worry, I'll handle that piece.
Okay, great. So that's the plan. So the first thing, right? I mean, the critical aspect of security. I don't know how many of you are coming from a security background. I'm going to assume that, you're all in DappCamp, so you're all developers in the Web2 world, or getting into the Web3 world, or getting better in the Web3 world in one of the chains. And this is sort of chain agnostic for the most part. But security, from a principle perspective, right? There are three parts to it. And you'll see this being referred to, if you've taken any courses in security, you'll see the CIA principles of security. So those are the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? So that is real. And there, of course, there are others like non-repudiation and some other things, but these really form sort of the three pillars of security, right? So that is one part. And then the other way to think about security is in terms of assets, actors, and actions, right? So assets can be different, in the Web2 and the Web3 world. And if there are no assets of meaningful value, then there's really, nothing to be secured. So assets is really fundamental to security, right? That is really what we are protecting. Those could be, in the Web2 world, those could be our private information, it could be our data, it could be our infrastructure, really any of those things. So that is that is really why security exists, to protect the assets. And then we have actors. So actors are the ones who own the assets, who act upon the assets, who trade them, own them, rent them, manage them, use them, or misuse them, right? So actors are obviously the real reason why security exists. And if the actors, if they're all good, if they're all trusted, then of course security is not a concern. But there is a notion of good actors and bad actors, right? So that is another way to think about security. So we have assets, and then we have actors. And of course, we have actions, right? I mean, those are really the way that actors work on the assets. It could be creating the assets, it could be taking them, renting them, buying them, using them, or misusing them. So those are sort of the three pillars, the CIA, if you want to think of it that way. And then we have the other sort of the trifecta, right? We have the assets, actors, and actions. So in that sort of mental model of security, there are 10 perspectives that I'll be touching upon. And these exist in the Web2 world, and they get amplified or they get changed, or in some cases, they're very different in the Web3 world. And the first one is keys and tokens. So this is something that you should have, be very familiar with. You should have looked at it in DappCamp. We have keys, public key cryptography, with which we manage really everything in the Web3 world. And then we have tokens, right? So in this case, tokens are really the assets. And keys can also be thought of as assets because, I mean, those are the assets that control the tokens. So losing any of these keys or tokens is really irreversible in the Web3 world, right? So that, I mean, that notion of, and these exist, so keys, cryptography obviously has existed for a long, long time. We make use of that extensively in the Web2 world. Many times, well, most times unknowingly. I mean, if you ask an end user, then we're just using HTTPS, we're using cryptography in various parts of the stack. We're using it to maybe sign things, hash things, and so on, right? But that sort of becomes, that's upfront, right and center in the Web3 world. Right. So there's, I mean, at least for the developers that we see today, and even for the users, there is really no way to not know what keys are, right? So in terms of using wallets, in terms of using the assets that they're buying or exchanging or swapping, right? So this notion of keys and tokens is critical in the Web3 space, and their security is really sort of the primary goal of everything that happens in the Web3 space. The second aspect in the Web3 world, right? I mean, these have like philosophical and technical implications to everything that happens in the Web3 space, right? So keys and tokens is really the fundamental aspect. And then the other one that you will really hear about in different ways is about the blockchain being immutable, about dApps being unstoppable, right? And a lot of these are sort of aspirational goals, philosophical goals. I mean, that's sort of, it's also the reason why a lot of these things are designed the way they are, both the blockchains as well as dApps. So let's talk about unstoppable, right? So once somebody deploys something, well, in this case, let's say we're talking about smart contracts, right? Once you deploy it, ideally, there should be no way for anyone to be able to stop that smart contract from doing what it's supposed to do, right? But of course, you'll have various access control measures, you'll have admins, you'll have certain privileged users who may be able to pause it, I'm not sure if you have covered those aspects in DappCamp about the possible aspects, circuit breakers, and things like that. So those are again fundamental aspects that are implemented within the smart contracts. But at a high level, these smart contracts, I mean, there is nothing, there should be nothing, not even the developers or the DAOs or whoever the governance, the multi-sigs that are behind these contracts should be technically able to stop it or remove it or do anything of that sort, right? Because this is the whole sort of the Web3 movement is really about, I mean, permissionless is one aspect, but then there is also the censorship resistant aspect, right? So contrast that with an app store, a Play Store, right? Where a particular app may be removed from the app store, for various reasons, because of the content, because of breach of contract. I mean, it could be removed in certain geos because of geopolitical aspects, right? So that aspect of security, and that sort of affects the availability aspect, right? In the CIA principle, the availability aspect, the censorship resistant aspect, the always on, always accessible aspect. So that is a critical security aspect that we really don't think about it too much from a developer perspective, but unless you get into the weeds of, okay, I'm implementing a possible, there are circuit breakers, and those things become critical once you look at some of the widely used protocols, right? So that is something, again, very, very critical to security, availability, censorship resistance that should be paid attention to. The second part here is immutable, right? I mean, this is sort of the holy grail of blockchains. A block is added, and after a certain number of confirmations, and depending on what chain it is it proof of work, is it proof of stake, things are considered to be, sort of set in stone, right? A transaction happened, and that's it, right? Beyond a certain number of blocks, after a certain number of time has passed, those transactions cannot be reversed, right? There are, of course, exceptions to this, like reorgs and things like that, or forks, but we won't get into that. But that is sort of the holy grail of things being immutable, because this entire space is, really about trust minimization as well, right? We should not have to trust a blockchain, any part of the infrastructure, the blockchain protocol itself, for a particular transaction to not be reversed at a certain point in future. And that immutable aspect is also, plays a big role when you're building smart contracts, because think about software development in the Web2 world, right? Have you ever, think about software updates, right? Most of us have automatic software updates on our laptops for the OS, for various apps. And the reason there is, we have, different features being added, we have performance improvements, but there's also security bugs that are fixed, right? So focusing on the security aspect, when we write code, when we ship code, there is really no guarantee. I mean, theoretically, we can't guarantee that that code is free of bugs, right? Anything that is non-trivial. So if that is the case, if we know that there could be bugs, and if we want the contract to be immutable, to be non-upgradable, then think about the security implications, right? How will we fix it? What are the implications? Are we okay with, a particular hack happening when we know that there's a particular vulnerability, right? That is there in the contract. So obviously, the developers, the team behind it, will want to fix it. Now, that by upgrading the contract in this case. So that mutable? Is that immutable? How does that sort of where does that fit in that spectrum, right? So that is another critical aspect. I mean, this is again a philosophical aspect, a design aspect, and definitely has implications on how you implement smart contracts, right? So I'm guessing that the participants have read about upgradability, right? So there is, I mean, none of these are sort of open and shut problems, right? I mean, this is being debated. The upgradability aspect is debated in the security, uh, uh, in the various discussions group. On Twitter, you'll see people are pro, people are against, and the reason is because upgradability can be a feature, but then it could also be a bug, because if it is not done properly, then someone else, right? I mean, the team itself, it could be a rug pull, right? The team itself, might actually upgrade it. Initially, might have a contract that looks very clean, quote unquote clean from a security perspective, but then they may upgrade it to a malicious contract that maybe takes away all the tokens, changes the parameters of the protocol, and increases the fee to the protocol by an absurd margin, or to an absurd number. So there are various ways, right? Or it could be that the team is actually benign, and actually wants to upgrade it correctly and has the upgradability as a feature in the contract or protocol, but then they have not set the parameters, and they have not actually followed there's a specific process to be followed in in the proxy implementation. So if they have not followed that, then an attacker can come in, right, and can actually break the contract, or could upgrade it and point the proxy to a malicious implementation, and the game is over at that point, right? So these are sort of critical things to think about and sort of dive into the technical aspects. And from a security perspective, just to sort of dial up the contrast in this case and give an example of how critical upgradability is, there have been multiple critical bugs, right, in widely used protocols. And if you have been sort of following the security news in the space, the largest bug bounty was announced rather, maybe I think just in the last week, and it was for $10 million, right? And this was a bug related to initializing a proxy contract, which has to do with mutability or immutability, right? So there are huge implications to thinking about these aspects and to be implementing them correctly from a security perspective. Okay. So I'll just sort of keep steaming ahead, assuming there are no questions. But if there are, feel just stop me at any point, and we can dive into any concrete examples or any of the technical aspects that may have been covered in the DappCamp cohort so far. All right, so the other perspective is about open source and transparency. So open source, it's a movement, and it's been a movement in the Web2 space. I mean, in the broader internet space for a long, long time. But nevertheless, if you pay attention to how much of the software we use, right, be it the operating systems, be it the hardware that we are running the operating systems on, or the applications, how many of them are open source, you will see that, well, any one of us that is using a Windows laptop or a Apple, right, or any of the mobile phones, right? I mean, there are parts of it that may be open source, but there are big parts of it that are not, right? And transparency sort of goes hand in hand with that, right? In terms of what is happening in that code, what is happening when we use the internet, how is our data being collected, the privacy aspects, all those things. So that's the Web2 world that sort of we have been in for a couple of decades now. Now contrast that with the Web3, the Web3 ecosystem, right? So there are again multiple ecosystems here, but talking about Ethereum, the ethos in this ecosystem is that everything should be open source by default, right? That's the spirit, that's the aspiration. There could be business reasons why certain things may become open source over time. There could be other licensing aspects of software that may prevent clones from happening. But again, from a source perspective, from a software perspective, the source is open because that is fundamental to the trust minimization or the trustlessness, if you want to really dial up the contrast, right? This applies not only to smart contracts, but also to the infrastructure, to the off-chain components, but very much so to the smart contracts, right? It'll be very surprising to find a very widely used protocol in the Ethereum ecosystem whose smart contracts are not source verified on Etherscan, right? So it's not just open sourced, but we want to make sure that the version that is deployed is the bytecode that is deployed on the blockchain is or matches a particular code that was verified on one of the platforms such as Etherscan. So that has huge implications because security by obscurity, if you haven't heard of that phrase, that is often used in the Web2 world. I mean, if you don't know what security processes have been followed, what the security of a particular software or protocol is, we have no clue, of the guarantees the security guarantees that are being offered by the operating system or the software that we're using, right? But if it is open sourced, we at least have an option to go and to verify, right? To be able to check if it has any bugs or if things have been fixed. If not, what the reasons were and so on. So that aspect of open source that is fundamental. Is fundamental to Web3 or big parts of Web3. And then the other aspect is the transparency part, right? So contrary to what many people believe, in blockchains, in Ethereum, for example, you go to Etherscan, you see every interaction, right? Every transaction that is happening, you see which address it came from, which address or which contract it is talking to, what data was sent, what the result was, how many tokens were transferred, the whole thing, right? So everything is there on the blockchain, right? So everything is transparent. And this is true for protocols, for treasuries, for governance tokens. Everything for wallets. Of course, if you have centralized exchanges, then you don't see what's happening behind that address, but everything on that address is on the blockchain, right? And it's not just the transactions that have happened, but we also can see the transactions that are going to or that may happen in future. And this is typically referred to as a mempool, right? So there are exceptions. We have flashbots, we have MEVs, we have private relays, and so on. But in general, when you submit a transaction, using your favorite wallet, that transaction sits in the mempool and then gets picked up by a miner or very soon by a validator, and gets put into a particular block that may or may not get accepted. So that aspect of a transaction sitting in the mempool, right, before it can be accepted and sort of set in stone as part of one of the blocks in the blockchain, that has huge implications, right? Think of front-running attacks, think of sandwich attacks, right? So these, I'm not sure if you've covered some of these things, but just Google. This is all over the place. But all these things are made possible because if an attacker can know what transaction is going to, if I submitted a particular transaction and if somebody can see that, hey, this may be accepted, then I can front run it, or I can back run it, or I can sandwich it, and then in ways to make profit from that transaction, right? By arbitrage or any other ways. And this, it's not just for arbitrage opportunities, but this has huge implications to security as well. Because think of, if you've deployed a contract and you know that it has a bug, right? Or if you're changing some critical parameters in that contract, and you as a deployer or as as part of the multi-sig or governance, if you deploy a transaction without a private relay in the mempool, then somebody who's we have tools for monitoring mempools as well, right? And these are all there. These are free to use. So if somebody is monitoring that, they can front run your transaction that is going to, let's say, fix a particular parameter in your protocol. It could be any address, or it could be any other sort of mathematical parameter that has security implications. They could front run it, and they could actually profit from it. Or they could see that, hey, somebody is actually trying to fix something, and that could give an indication that there is a vulnerability, and they could exploit it. All these things are automated, right? So nobody is really sitting. People can sit and monitor it manually, but these things are codified. There are bots and other, sophisticated ways to do this as well. So that is sort of the implication of these transactions being transparent, right? And this, for those few who've been in the Web2 space or security space, this is like an audit log, right? Audit logs have huge security values. There are multi-billion-dollar companies that are in the security space in Web2 that are built on looking at transactions, analyzing them to figure out for bugs and so on, or attacks and exploits. Big part of the Web2 security space. So that is sort of the challenge and the opportunity in the Web3 security space, right? And there are teams that are building, like OpenZeppelin's Porter and others, that are building services that actually help you look into these transactions because of these, because of them being transparent. So not sure if I'm sort of covering things that are interesting, but let me pause here to see if there are, if this has struck some chord, and if there are any questions.
Yeah, there's a question from Tarun. Do you want to go for it, Tarun?
Yep. Thank you, Rajeev, for this session. I think I found the part you mentioned about somebody could be deploying a change to either some sort of a logic or fix a bug, and that could be monitored and reviewed through mempool. Some bad actor could be looking for that. Can you share a specific example around that? I found that really interesting.
Sure. Not off the top of my head, but then that's a common. It's a front running attack, right? So front running attacks are common. Attacks or not, right? There are arbitrage opportunities. Some of them may cast them as as being malicious, but some of them may say that, hey, it's all fair game. But to your specific point about deploying a fix and somebody monitoring the fix, I will dig up an example and share that with I'll pass it over to the DappCamp team, and then they can share it with you.
Cool. Thank you, Rajeev. That would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to understand is is it just a few set of transactions that they're monitoring? Is it a new contract logic or encoding or anything around that people are monitoring, and just understanding the flow of that? But thank you for following up on that later.
Sure. So I don't think we know what exactly the bad actors are monitoring in this space, except for the cases where there have been exploits that have been recognized and sort of publicly discussed. But it's fair game to assume that if you're deploying a contract, right? And if you, very simple example, let's assume that you know what possible, this is PAUSABLE, right? The possible OpenZeppelin library that gives you an opportunity to pause a particular function or a certain set of functions in your contract, right? So let's say that you're using that, right? And that is typically recommended as part of your guarded launch mechanism with smart contract protocols, because you don't know if there's a problem. You know, there could be a problem, so you may want to pause critical functions, especially the ones where people are taking funds out of the protocol, or even functions where people are depositing funds into the protocol, because you don't want the state to get messed up or modified once you know that there's something wrong with it. So let's assume that you have that circuit breaker mechanism implemented in your protocol, right? And this is done in, I would say many of the protocols. So you have that, and then you come to know about a particular bug in the protocol, right? So because of bug bounty, or because of you find a bug yourself within your protocol, and you execute a transaction that a specific transaction to pause a particular function in your protocol, right? Or the entire protocol itself. So if that is done via the mempool, then that is obviously a clear indication that there is something so critically wrong that the protocol is pausing the protocol itself. I mean, it is pausing the operations, right? So that could be an indication. I mean, it doesn't give much to the attacker except knowing that there's something wrong with the protocol. But they could probably know that, hey, if it's going to be paused, if it's a really widely used protocol, maybe they decide to short that token, right, of that protocol, the native token of the protocol, and profit from it, right? Because security obviously affects. I mean, if you do something like that, and if you're a widely used protocol, then pausing the protocol reduces the confidence of the users and the investors, and it's likely that the token's value, right, will be affected, right? So that is one way. I mean, it's not. I mean, the attacker is still. It's not really an attacker in the truest sense. I mean, they're not manipulating the vulnerability because of which you're trying to pause the protocol, but they're still profiting by observing that you're pausing the protocol, right? So that is sort of a generic example that should apply to, I think, should apply to all protocols in this particular scenario.
Cool. Thank you very much, Rajeev. I think the possible example was like great. I think that is the exact kind of example I was looking for, because most of my thought process around these were just around MEV and like arbitraging. But you've definitely given me another angle to like think through now. Thank you.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, I am certain that there are concrete examples where the attacker has, or in this case, a bot. I mean, this is most likely, very likely a bot has manipulated a particular protocol based on a particular transaction. I mean, there are. I mean, nobody knows for sure, right? Did they monitor it? We have no clue that they monitored it. But and even in this bug bounty case, right, that I'm talking about, so just Google for it. It is it's a bounty in the wormhole protocol in the bridge, and the bounty was paid out or announced just last week. So in this case, the initializing of the proxy was done about a year ago, right? And then I think there was something else done. I won't get into details, but then it was missed. The particular action did not happen again after a certain upgrade or something happened in the near recent past, right? So did somebody monitor the fact that, I mean, the code is out there. It's already been sort of dissected after the fact that it was revealed, the bug bounty was revealed. But all these things are possible, right? So lot of security implications when you design protocols, or when you're trying to break them as a bounty hunter, or when you're trying to protect them from a security perspective in the space. So let's jump to the other part. Let me just see how I'm doing on time. All right.
There's also a question in chat.
So,
Do you want to add, or should we move on and then come back to that?
No, we can take it.
Satish is asking, can you explain how front-running attacks might happen in the Web3 world?
Oh, so I'll just touch upon it. I mean, this is widely known. So I would just say, Google it, and you will see a lot of material for it. But front running essentially happens when you have a transaction that is submitted, and then somebody observes a transaction, manually, a bot, very likely, and wants to get ahead of it, or wants to be executed before it from the blockchain's perspective, right? So in this case, all that I need to make sure as somebody who's trying to front run your transaction is I need to, well, very simply put, if the transaction fees is an indication of a particular transaction getting accepted, then in a block that is that is before yours, then I use I submit a transaction with a much higher fee, right? So that it gets included in a block before yours, right? So that is one easy way to explain it. I mean, there are obviously technical details there. If you want to get included in the same block before a particular transaction and right after it, there are ways to do that as well. So there is front running, and then there is back running, and then if you want to do both, that is called the sandwich attack. And there is, I would say, in the interest of time, there's a lot of resources that I can point to. I'll be happy to share maybe a list of links after this call with the DappCamp team with references to all these aspects. All right.
Perfect. Yeah, we can keep going forward.
Cool. So in contrast to the sort of the openness and the transparency, the other aspect that you would see in Web3 that has implications on security is the counter aspect, right? The pseudonymity, right? So there are pseudonymous teams. There are certainly pseudonymous individuals that you would see on crypto Twitter and behind protocols themselves that have and are deploying protocols, right? And this has implication because if you look at the Web2 world, and if you look at what makes you trust a particular software, right? Is it from Apple? I'm just taking examples and names here, but it could apply to anyone. Is a particular software, is it on the App Store? Is it which means that okay, it has been through, it's gained some reputation because it has been vetted by the App Store team based on all their guidelines. I mean, they run a whole bunch of security checks, privacy checks, data checks, data leak checks, all that stuff, or the Google Store or any other store for the matter, right? So you have a social reputation that is associated with a brand, with a team, with a project, with a company, with a person, because of which you trust that entity with, you trust transacting with that entity in some shape or manner, right? So that aspect is sort of ingrained in the Web2 world. I mean, it's used everywhere, and it's also abused everywhere, right? From a data privacy perspective, for that matter. I mean, take your favorite Facebook or any other example where you have abuses of privacy, right? So contrast that with the pseudonymous aspect. Would and this comes about in terms of trusting a protocol, trusting and interacting, or interacting with the protocol, be it in terms of as a user of the protocol, as an investor into the protocol. Would you trust someone or some team that is entirely pseudonymous, entirely based on their work, right? Based on the protocol that they've built, based on the open source aspect. You have no clue who they are. You have no clue what their pedigree is. So it's effectively proof of work. In some way, it is proof of work that they've done building the protocol, but there's no pedigree, right? You have no clue. Are they from an Ivy League university? Are they from, do they have have they worked at a FANG company before? You have no clue, right? So that social reputation, that reputation aspect has a huge security implication that doesn't really get talked about as much, when you look at it purely from a technical aspect. But again, this has had big security implications, especially when it comes to rug pulls, which is when the project team itself, decides to exploit their users in some shape or form. So that is one part. And then we have DAOs. I'm assuming that people are familiar with DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. So in this case, very simply put, DAOs are communities built around or token holders, communities built around token holders of a particular protocol that get to vote on the governance aspects of the protocol, right? It could be various things. So when you look at this, and this is happening with many of the widely used protocols today, has happened with the widely used protocols today. When you look at this, right, what about governance attacks? Can the DAOs come together to actually exploit the protocol itself for their own benefit, right? And this, again, there are examples. There's one recent example where for a particular protocol, there was a flash loan where somebody took a flash loan, bought a whole bunch of tokens, gained a majority share in that token holding community, and they voted on proposals that were that made their exploit possible, right? That actually proposed some changes to the protocol, which included a vulnerability that they could exploit, right? So I'll point out this and the links that I'll send later on, but this is again a fascinating example. I mean, in a bad way, of course, where the DAOs, the governance aspect has been abused. And this is, again, it is a discussion that is very much happening. There's no clear, good answer to this yet from a security perspective. Now, think about the other angle, right? Let's say that you deploy a protocol, you have a DAO around it, and now you want to implement a security fix, right? It's not as simple as in the Web3 world where the team comes together and they decide that, ouch, there's a 0 day in my app, so I'm going to submit this fix and roll out a version 8.9.12, and then boom, right? Everybody, it's all automatically updated. Life is good. We go, nobody knows that there was a 0 day, assuming it wasn't exploited, right? So in this case, in the Web3 world, if you come across a bug in your protocol, right? A bug, be it through a bug bounty or you found it yourself, and you have a DAO. Now, that change to the protocol has to be approved, right? Assuming that that emergency mechanism has been built into your protocol. And there are, again, for good reasons, there are time locks built into the DAO mechanism itself, into the popular governance mechanisms itself, that prevent a DAO from enforcing a huge change or any change to the protocol, right? So there's usually a time lock, a time delay that is enforced so that a bad sort of set of actors can't collude and propose and implement a bad fix to exploit it later. So if you really have a good fix, right, a fix that is badly needed, and it is also forced to go through this time lock, then going back to the previous question that someone asked earlier, now you have proposed the fix is out there, right? It's open source, people can see what the fix is, and unless there is a commit reveal kind of a scheme, people can see what the fix is. They know exactly what the bug is in the protocol. And now there is a time lock that prevents the fix from being deployed to the protocol. It could be, few seconds, but it's typically in hours or days, right? So that gives a window of opportunity to the attackers to exploit that vulnerability, assuming that it hasn't been paused, right? So this again, has tremendous implications to the security processes in the Web3 space, right? So let me, in the interest of time, let me jump ahead. I think there's a lot of sort of ground that we can cover here, but this is sort of getting more technical, right? We are working with architectures, we are working with blockchains. In the case of Ethereum, it's been sort of around for less than a decade, right? Maybe about 8 years, and it's matured in the last 5 to 6 years. The architecture is completely new. The whole concept of blockchain is new. There are new languages. Solidity, Viper, Free. There are so many languages being developed. Tool chains haven't the tool chains that you use. I'm guessing that you've looked at Hard Hat or maybe most likely Hard Hat or Truffle, right? So a lot of these are being built as we speak, right? So they're still new, and what happens, one of the fundamental things with security is this notion of something being battle tested or time tested. In the Web2 world, we have had operating systems, we have had the networking stack, TCP/IP, that have been battle tested over decades. But in this case, when we say battle tested libraries, we really mean like a year, right? So the timescales in crypto are really warped. So we should, put this in perspective from an expectation perspective, right? So when you expect a certain thing to be quote unquote secure or quote unquote mature, you're looking at something that was built maybe 6 months ago, right? Or 12 months ago. So that has a huge security implication for obvious reasons, right? And then the other aspect is composability. Everything that you do in this case, right? Because protocols are supposed to be permissionless, they're supposed to be censorship resistant. So anybody can really send a transaction and interact with your protocol, assuming you don't have any sort of access control or whitelist sort of hard-coded in it, right? So users can interact with it. Other protocols, other smart contracts can obviously interact with it. And this composability is by design, right? So that's sort of the ethos, that we do not want a walled garden, right? Where we want only approved protocols to be able to interact, right? Because that is not sort of the ethos or the philosophy of being permissionless or censorship resistant. So when you think about this, right? And when you build your protocol, think about the security implications. Think about the attack surface, right? Because now your protocol is really, once you deploy it, it's out there and anyone else can sort of build on top of it. You would have heard of this analogy of Legos, right? All these things are Legos. You've heard of financial Legos, DeFi being the financial Legos, but all these Legos, are they really sort of, do they fit together? Is it really part of one puzzle, or are they going to fall down like a deck of cards, right? So that, there are two sides to this. Composability by design is aspirational, but then from a security perspective, it raises or it increases the attack surface by orders of magnitude without even giving you a chance, right, of being able to address that. It makes it very, very challenging. Yeah. So that is, again, at a high level, something to think about. And then, so all this is well and good, but when it comes to the reality, right, let's talk about the timeline. So security, absolute security. So there is sort of a thing that is said in the security circles that if you have infinite resources, if you have infinite time, then anything can be broken, right? I mean, this is true for cryptographic protocols. There are certain assumptions on the resources that your adversary has. But in the case of Web3, right, think about the time scale that you're operating in, right? And let's take an example of DappCamp itself, right? So I'm guessing that in the 3 weeks, right, that you have, you would have learned enough to build your protocol and to build at least a straw man of your protocol, an idea around it, and to be able to deploy it and interact with it, right? Now, that is really happening in this space because there are just so many experiments happening. You have DeFi, we have NFTs, we have DAOs, we have governance structures, so many things happening. So people really want to build a protocol and want to deploy it without sort of missing that boat, so to say. So in that sense, how much time would you really get to apply the right security design principles, the right security testing, right, and using the right tools, and all that, right? I'll get to audits in a bit, but even if you think of a time scale of 6 months or a year between an idea and a launch, is that good enough, right? Is that good enough to bake in enough security processes, design, implementation, review, all that? And the obvious answer is it is not, but then that is the reality, right? We are dealing with extremely compressed timescales in this space that it really becomes challenging for developers not to cut corners, right? Not to take shortcuts when it comes to security. So that again is sort of should be a guiding principle for all of you when you're deploying your protocols, your products. So let me sort of jump through the last two. I think I just have 2 or 3 high-level points to talk about. So the test and prod is a meme that you would hear about or being joked about on crypto Twitter at least. So this is essentially means that your testing or validation should really happen in a sandbox environment. Obviously not in a production setting. I mean, you don't deploy it and then test. There is even a paradigm in software engineering called test-driven development, TDD, where you're supposed to really write the test before you write the code that allows the test to pass, right? So that is sort of the best case scenario from a security or a testing software engineering perspective. But then we do see cases where, because of compressed timescales, because of all these other aspects that I talked about, the real world testing happens when you deploy your protocol onto the blockchain, right? Not onto the mainnet, not on a test net, right? And that could be, again, there are real reasons, there are sort of real practical reasons why that sort of cannot be avoided, because if you really want the entire blockchain state, then it used to be very hard to sort of test with that. But then we do have services like Tenderly and others who are making it easier. But this is something that you should keep in mind. How much should I test, right, before I go into production? And how much of that testing may happen in production? Because, I mean, this is an adversarial environment that we have not seen in the Web2 world. So this is something you may have sort of touched upon in your DappCamp. Web3, in the blockchain setting, we're really working with a Byzantine threat model. So everything in security boils down to a threat model and a trust model. Who do you trust? Who don't you trust, right? And obviously, if you trust somebody, then they're not a threat. And if you don't trust somebody, they are a threat. And that threat model sort of translates into an attack surface. And then you start looking at vulnerabilities and exploits and so on. So in a Web2 model, right, there is a notion of trusted actors or insiders, and then untrusted outsiders or users or attackers. But in the Web3 world, every actor, right, could be malicious, right? So that is what a Byzantine threat model refers to. I'm oversimplifying, but you can look this up. And this is something that was, obviously it came about in the distributed systems world, but that applies sort of very critically to the blockchain world. So we are looking at a Byzantine threat model where any actor, right? It could be the miners, it could be the validators, it could be the infrastructure providers, it could be the developer team itself, it could be the users, it could be really it could be anyone, right? I mean, from a governance perspective, it could be the investors, the token holders, anyone could be a threat to the protocol and the protocol functioning, right? And this is all based on mechanism design, game theory, and so on. So that is a very critical, or should be a very critical sort of guiding principle when you think about security and designing your protocol, right? Now let's get to the last point. So this is probably something that very practical that you would face if you're going to take the project or the protocol that you're building in DappCamp, and that you want to sort of pursue it, not as a hobby, as a learning, as a workshop, but to really deploy it as a protocol in the real world. There is a notion of audit, right? So audit is essentially an external third-party security assessment that looks at your protocol. I mean, in this case, let's say your smart contract, and make sure, make sure that within the bounds of how much time they have, there are fewer bugs than when you, when they started reviewing it. So they take a look at your code, and when I say they, so there are multiple teams that are doing audits. There are companies that are doing audits. There are freelancers doing audits. There are DAOs that are doing audits. So this is something that is very practical, right? This is something that happens day in and day out. And this is important. I mean, this is sort of, again, a huge difference in the Web2 world. You don't hear about this so much. But in the Web3 world, in the smart contract world, this has become sort of a critical, part or a critical dependency between a protocol that is developed and that is waiting to be launched, right? The need for an audit. And that need arises because the protocol team itself does not have enough security expertise to be able to look at all the, find as many bugs, obvious ones in the protocol and fix it before deploying, right? So they tend to go to somebody, they tend to get a third, second pair of eyes, an external set of experts who do this day in and day out, and so they know what a front running is, what a sandwich is, all these other things, right? With your smart contract, and they fix as many, or they help you fix as many of that as possible before you deploy, right? But the challenge here is that audit is seen as a silver bullet, right? I mean, as with many things in security, there is no silver bullet. I mean, security, there is nothing that is fully secure, be it your smart contract or be it anything else. But from a developer's perspective, right? I mean, here I'm assuming I'm talking to all developers here, right? So from a developer's perspective, be assured that an audit is not a silver bullet. I mean, audit will definitely take you, make your code that much. I mean, will give you that much more assurances about the quality, the vulnerabilities in it, and so on will be reduced. But do not think of it as sort of a blank. Do not think of it as a guarantee or as a sort of a marketing checkbox saying that, okay, great, I got an audit, now I'm ready, so my code is bug free, so nothing bad is going to happen, right? So that is not realistic. So it makes it better, definitely makes it better depending on which team you're working with, but then it is not a silver bullet, right? So with that, let me pause to see if there are any questions, and I think I have definitely run out of time. I think this was for an hour, but happy to take questions and talk more about any of these aspects if people are interested.
Sure, we'll take one or two questions. Thomas in chat is asking, is there a place where we can learn more about the Secureum bootcamp?
Yes. So yeah, I looked up resources, but they were all from 2021. Yes, unfortunately, that is true. So the resources on Substack or YouTube that you may have found are from Q4 of 21. But Securium is entirely an online community that functions on the Discord. So I can share the link. I mean, you can look up on Twitter. It's Securium, or I can type it out here. Yeah, so that's the Twitter handle, which should give you a Discord link. So it exists purely on Discord, and it is completely online. It's completely asynchronous. It's free to join, and the bootcamp is always running. And in this case, there are some resources, and once you are comfortable with those resources, you can participate in what are known as races, which are really races like a smart contract quiz. And depending on how well you perform, the top participants are invited to take part in workshops and security reviews and so on. So all those things are happening as we speak. Feel free to take a look.
Awesome. I have one kind of, it's not a question, but I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Like, you mentioned some good points, like Audit being thought of as a silver bullet. While it's really not a silver bullet, it's kind of just one of the things you should be doing. And then, talking about how deploying in prod or deploying on mainnet is really the only way to really test your smart contracts. So it sounds like there's really no foolproof way to really think about security, which is obvious, and experience and launching smart contracts on mainnet and learning from mistakes is probably the best way to continue to harden our practices. Would you agree with that, or do you feel that there's more that we could be doing pre-mainnet to harden our practices? Almost like feeling the hard way, the only way to kind of learn these mistakes.
Right. I mean, that was so test and prod is certainly dialing up the contrast a lot, right? I mean, yes, there are maybe certain things that we can learn from a game theoretic perspective only on the mainnet. And an example is, let's say that you have done everything that you can, right? I mean, you have the best security due diligence. You've used let's say all the tools. You've used, as an example, you've used Slither, you've used Mythex, you've run formal verification tools, you've run Echidna fuzzing, you've done Certora prover, you've got the best teams or individuals to do a manual analysis of your smart contract, and then you have 100% test coverage, and you've gone through that whole thing, and you've deployed in a test net, and then finally you launch on the mainnet. There are still things that we can do, right? I mean, in terms of a guarded launch mechanism, you can have pause mechanisms, you can have circuit breakers such as that, you can have emergency mechanisms, all those things, right? So I doubt, I mean, I can say with certainty that not all projects are doing all this before they launch on mainnet, right? I mean, otherwise we wouldn't see some very trivial vulnerabilities. I mean, these have been best practices for the last 2+ years, right? I mean, we are still seeing examples, concrete examples of burn functions being public, right? Or transfer functions being public, right? So those, contrast what we are discussing here with that, So there is certainly a long way to go before the sort of the whole I mean, this again depends on the chain, the maturity of the protocol, and so on. But there are so many things that can be done before just saying, let's just put on the mainnet and let's cross our fingers and hopefully if something bad happens, we'll learn. I mean, I'm saying that from a game theoretic perspective, there are certain things that may not surface unless you put it on the mainnet, but I think those are very few and very rare.
Okay, that's really helpful. Awesome. This is super, super awesome. And Anil, feel free to DM Rajeev and answer your question, because we do have to go to the next session. But thanks, Rajeev. I think you gave us a lot of interesting subjective and more objective things to think about. I'll definitely rewatch the lecture and mull over the things you said. And if someone wants to reach you or has questions, is the Secureum Discord the best way to reach you?
Yes, I think that is probably the best.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, if you aren't part of it, just ping us and we can tell you how to join it. And yeah, thank you so much, Rajeev. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you for having me. And yeah, happy to take more questions. And I will make sure I send over some of the links that people asked about.
Sure. Yeah, we'll share it with the group.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you, Preeti, and the rest of the DappCamp team for having me. And yeah.